Hi, this video is in response to Turtletype's video entitled Partial Preterism versus Consistent Full Preterism. First of all, the use of the word consistent is trying to imply that partial preterism is inconsistent. Obviously, partial preterists wouldn't believe partial preterism if they felt it was inconsistent. That's just kind of a derogatory term. Partial preterists have used the term heretical preterism to refer to full preterism, but I choose not to do that. I don't think we need to enter into that kind of insulting. But you mentioned that it's a time statement issue that partial preterists have a problem with. It's not a time statement issue that is the purpose of seeing partial preterism. The issue is explicit statements that are made in the New Testament about resurrection, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let me just say this right now, dealing with that. 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of Christ's bodily resurrection. We know it was bodily, we know it was physical, we know it was visible, because Paul distinctly said over 500 people saw it. And he says that's a precursor to the resurrection of the saints by calling it a first fruits resurrection. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that everybody who's going to be made alive is going to be in two categories. Christ the first fruits, afterwards those that are Christ's at his coming. Now, he's saying that everybody that will ever be made alive will be in one of those two categories. Now, if you're saying that the coming of Christ with that resurrection occurred in AD 70, then the rest of us are out. Nobody else is going to be made alive, because go back to the verse before that. It talks about all who are in Adam die, but all will be made alive in Christ. And it says those that are Christ at his coming follow Christ the first fruits resurrection. So Christ the first fruits and those that are Christ at his coming speak of everyone who's ever going to be made alive. So that means we're all out because we weren't there in AD 70. We didn't rise then. You see, this is a big major problem with full preterism, is they're not reading the context in which statements are made. When it refers to Christ the first fruits and Christ's those who are Christ's at his coming, it's talking about what the previous verse said. All will be made alive in Christ. At any rate, you can't change the definition of resurrection halfway through 1 Corinthians 15 from Christ's physical, visible resurrection to an invisible, non-physical resurrection in the latter part of 1 Corinthians 15 in reference to the church. Partial preterists also don't argue that there's a coming of Jesus that deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. We don't deny that the end of the world and the end of the age is the end of the Jewish economy of Old Covenant activity. So you're wasting most of your video dealing with things that partial preterists agree. You would address those things to futurists. We never said there would be an end of Christ's kingdom. They're points, again, that futurists need to hear you speak about. So all your words about his kingdom continuing past AD 70 are moot points if you're refuting partial preterism. We agree that heaven and earth refers to covenantal aspects using Hebraic terminology, and we agree that the first century terms are mentioned everywhere in the New Testament, and we agree time statements for judgment regard the first century. So most of your video doesn't even address the true differences between full and partial preterism. But your words about a resurrection occurring at the end of the Jewish economy is error. You said without proof that the last trumpet mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 is the seventh trumpet of Revelation 11. On what basis do you make that statement? Just because trumpets are mentioned? 1 Corinthians 15 was written well before the book of Revelation was even given to John, when he wrote that book. In order for 1 Corinthians 15's last trumpet to refer to the seventh trumpet of Revelation, Paul's readers, who would be reading 1 Corinthians before Revelation was ever written, would have to have some kind of precedent that there are going to be seven trumpets in a certain vision that hadn't even been given yet, in order to understand that when Paul would say last trumpet, he meant a seventh one that would be written in the future by John in the book of Revelation. And of course, that's nonsense. No one reading Paul's letter at the time would know there would be seven trumpets in John's vision. Last trumpet is not a reference to a series of trumpets in a book that wasn't even written yet. Last trumpet is a commonly understood Hebraic phrase referring to the Feast of Trumpets. There were a series of trumpets blown, and then it was indicating that a new Hebraic civil year was beginning. The religious new year was in the spring, just before Passover, but the civil new year was after these feasts in the fall. And some people think that that means Jesus returns at the Feast of Trumpets, but that's not conclusive. But what I'm trying to do is show you that it does prove last trumpet has a meaning altogether different from a series of trumpets mentioned in Revelation. Revelation series of trumpets are part of a vision John had, and the series of 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 thunders, and 7 vials are inclusive to the book of Revelation alone. Though the events themselves in Revelation are certainly not restricted to the book of Revelation, they're found in other parts of the New Testament, the visionary emblems sometimes are. We can no more say that the 7th trumpet of Revelation is the last trumpet of Corinthians 15 than we can say the seals of Revelation include the seal of the Spirit in Ephesians 1 and 13. It's just mixing unrelated emblems and symbols. We have to have more than a simple reference to 7 trumpets in Revelation and a last trumpet in Corinthians 15 to establish the thought that Paul was referring to the 7th trumpet. Yes, we also agree the marriage supper occurred at AD 70, but that's not what 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about. He doesn't mention a marriage at all in 1 Corinthians 15. We don't regard the second coming as a third coming also. That's a straw man argument. The reason the second coming is yet future and the coming of the Lord in AD 70 is not called the second coming is because AD 70's coming was a localized coming in judgment only. It wasn't a general oversweeping coming of the Lord like the first coming was. When he came first, it was for sin to die on the cross. And as you quoted in Hebrews 9, the second time he's going to come is without sin. So it's speaking of comings that affect all mankind. His first coming affected all mankind. His second coming affected all mankind. The localized coming in AD 70 was only upon Judea and Jerusalem for the purpose of destruction. So 3 comings is not an issue with us. If you want to talk about several comings of the Lord that's going to make nonsense of a second coming, as you were trying to do, then what about every time Jesus comes to somebody in prayer? How many comings has there been in that case? What about Jesus coming to Mary and Martha's house when he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? I mean, if you're going to talk about every time Jesus came and try to show it's ridiculous to talk about a future second coming, then you've shot yourself in the foot with your own argument. The coming of Jesus in destruction is not to be considered a first or a second coming or in a series of a first or second comings. The first and second coming affected the earth and all mankind, the soul of every man, woman who would ever live or has lived. The second coming is a future coming because of that reason. The coming to Jerusalem in judgment doesn't fit that category. As Hebrews 9 says, he's coming a second time without sin. Well, when he comes to a believer in prayer, he's coming without sin. So what about that argument applied to your own understanding? He didn't come to die on a cross when he came to so-and-so to answer their prayers. So full preterists better stay away from that argument since it defeats their own belief. Now, you claim Jesus is not physically coming again, and your argument was that he is seated on the throne forever. Nowhere does the Bible indicate that a seating on the throne disallows him from physically coming again. You can't use that as an argument. His seating is simply a reference to him being king. It's not talking about him physically sitting down, although obviously he sat on a throne. Not sitting down forever has nothing to do with him being seated. Also, Matthew 24 doesn't mention a resurrection anywhere in its entire text. It's strictly speaking about a localized coming of judgment in Matthew 24. Now, you might refer to gathering the people from the 4 winds of heaven, but that's not a resurrection. Where is gathering people from the 4 corners of the earth or the 4 winds of heaven ever referred to in plain language as a resurrection? It's not there. See, here's the deal. Here's where you should be talking about what the real differences are. 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of a bodily resurrection of the saints at the coming of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 15 and 23 says that people who will be resurrected at his coming will rise at the end. Now let me read verse 22 to 24 in the American Standard Version. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive, but each in his own order. So now take about what verse 22 just said. Christ, everyone in Christ is going to be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then they that are Christ's at his coming. Then cometh the end, when he shall deliver up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have abolished all rule and all authority and power. Now, verse 22 is telling us that everybody in Christ who's ever going to be made alive are going to be made alive when verse 23 gives us the two time periods. One, Christ the first fruits, then those that are Christ at his coming. Now, again, I said this earlier, but if the resurrection occurred in AD 70, and that was the coming of Christ, of 1 Corinthians 15 and 23, then everyone who has been saved after that, they're out. They're not going to be made alive. They're not going to be resurrected. Because Paul was wrapping up and summarizing when everyone who will ever resurrect will resurrect. Verse 22, in other words, sets the precedent for the issue. Everyone will be made alive in Christ who's going to be recovered from Adam's all-inclusive death, making everyone dead. Verse 23 says that when everyone will be made alive, there's an order to this coming alive. Christ the first fruits, and then afterwards they that are Christ at his coming. If this is what verse 22 says it is, a list of everyone who will be made alive, and if full preterists are right in saying AD 70 was when the second group of people to be made alive occurred, that means no one else will resurrect since AD 70, and that's ridiculous. Even full preterists believe that as soon as a believer dies today, they are spiritually resurrected to be with the Lord. Their body stays in the grave, but their spirit comes forth in resurrection. No, the end when the Lord shall come has not been fulfilled yet. That's not talking about the end of the Jewish economy. The reason we know this is because the bodily resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 has not yet happened. And that's why full preterists reject a bodily resurrection, even though 1 Corinthians 15 says it's bodily. Look at verses 42 to 44. So also is the resurrection of the dead. There's a certain it here in the context, is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown in natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. The body is what resurrects in this chapter. And notice the terminology. The same it that is sown is the it that is raised, the physical body. But the body is changed in that resurrection, according to verse 51. So that it's no longer a physical mortal body, but it's a physical spiritual body. Now, here's where full preterists really get mixed up. They think spiritual means non-physical, and that's not true. 1 Corinthians 10, same book, same author, talks about spiritual meat and drink that Israel ate and drank in the wilderness. It was physical, but why was it called spiritual? Didn't mean it was non-physical. We know it was physical. But the reason it was called spiritual was because it symbolically represented Christ. He's our living water, he's our drink, and he's our meat, he's our manna. So spiritual is not a contrasting word with physical. It's a contrasting word with natural. Natural comes from a Greek term describing things that are driven or empowered by natural forces or natural life. Spiritual is still physical, but it's something empowered by supernatural life. In my experience with full preterists in the past, I find that they always seem to think natural means physical and spiritual means non-physical. And that's not true. So the body is resurrected in the second coming, just like Jesus' physical body was resurrected. In fact, 1 Corinthians 15 begins by speaking about a bodily resurrection of Jesus as a precursor to the bodily resurrection of the saints. That's why the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 cannot be the coming of the Lord in AD 70, in localized judgment upon Jerusalem. And what makes full preterism so dangerous to me is that it sees no end of Satan on the earth, no end of sin, and no end of death. and no end of sinners. It only sees Satan cast away from the individual believer, but never from the planet Earth. Meanwhile, Romans 5 says the negative work that Adam caused in bringing sin and death into the world is outweighed by the positive work of Jesus Christ. Paul taught that Christ's work was not equal in degree of the positive compared to the degree of how negative Adam's work was. In other words, Christ's work did not match and counter Adam's negative work, but Christ's work was far more positive than Adam's work was negative. If full preterism is correct, then this can't be true. Full preterism never sees Satan, sin, and death ever removed from the earth. That means the positive work of Jesus was far outweighed by the negative work of Adam, and that just can't be so. Full preterism has a weaker cross than partial preterism. In fact, full preterism differs from every other prophetic belief in this regard. Every other prophetic belief sees an end of Satan, an end of sin, and an end of death in the planet. Full preterism says these things will go on forever, and it really weakens the cross and gives more power to Satan, sin, and death than they need to have. God bless you. I hope this has helped clarify the position of full preterism and partial preterism.